Welcome to the Nintendo Power Retrospectives. I'm Count Zero. It's episode 30, and we're starting 1991 with issue number 20 of Nintendo Power, the first issue of the year. Let's get started. Our cover game for this issue is Megaman 3. The cover art is a mix of screenshot art and painted art, though I'd say that the painted portion is pretty terrible, particularly the faces on Mega Man and Rush. I have no idea what happened here, but whatever it was, it didn't go well. We start off this issue with the letters column, and a letter from a big name. Steve Wozniak, the Woz himself. Woz has written in to submit his high score for Tetris on the Game Boy. We have a new Mega Man game this issue with Mega Man 3, which is also our cover game. With this game, Mega Man now has Rush to back him up, aside from just non-specific items, which didn't really have a character to go with them. And we get a rundown of a couple of Rush's abilities. Additionally, we have a suggested boss order and maps of the stages for all 8 Robot Masters, plus the 4 Robot Master rematches that come after. We even get notes for all 5 segments of Dr. Wily's castle, though not detailed maps. Mega Man 3 has a lot more polish than the first 2 games of the series in all the right ways. The new floor slide ability is really simple to use, but fun to do, and really useful for some of the boss fights. And the game really gives you lots of opportunities to use it and to navigate through areas and various other boss conflicts and that sort of thing. The new weapons are also interesting as well, though as with the previous games, there are a few abilities which seem difficult to find good uses for, like the top spin ability. Probably the game's biggest change, aside from the use of Rush, is Proto Man, who makes his first appearance here, though the guide describes him as Break Man. Proto Man is an enemy who looks a lot like Mega Man, and who you'll generally have to fight about once per level, though he doesn't appear on some levels. Usually what will happen is you hear Proto Man's theme, which is fairly short, and then he will show up, and you'll have to fight him until he decides to teleport away. Proto Man's tactics are generally the same for most encounters. He bunny hops and spams with his ray gun, while also blocking your shots from the front using a shield, which is similar to Sniper Joe's shield from the first couple games. So what you have to do is generally slide underneath him, and then zap him from behind. Or run underneath him if you can get the timing right, but the slide ability is the best way to go. Other than that, the game plays a lot like earlier Mega Man games, and that's a good thing. The controls are perfect, the jumping is incredibly precise, and honestly I think the only thing this game needs we get in the next game with the charge shot. Other than that, it's great. I mean, once with the charge shot, I won't need to use turbo on my controller or anything like that to use the regular cannon or make the regular cannon more effective. So I definitely consider this an excellent improvement on the Mega Man franchise, something that is definitely a must-play for fans of the series. In fact, I'd even consider this a pretty good gateway game to the series, maybe even a little more than Mega Man 2. So, definitely something worth checking out. Next up is an article which goes in depth on how your NES cartridges work. To a certain degree, some of this also applies to Game Boy cartridges as well, and Super Nintendo cartridges in the future, but the focus of the article and most of the technical terminology and particular things which are discussed are focused on the NES. Basically, Nintendo Power is getting into the territory of some of their independent competitors, like EGM, by getting into the technical side of things. This issue gets into basically every type of ROM, or read-only memory, that is used in game cartridges, along with a description of the different types of memory management controllers, or MMCs, that are used in game cartridges, and talking about what they bring to the table. Obviously, when we get to the Super NES, that will have different MMCs than the NES does, and possibly different types of RAM as well. But the principles are the same in terms of what makes a cartridge work the way it does. Next, we have a guide on The Immortal, a fantasy adventure game from EA. Unfortunately, this game uses a isometric camera angle, which is a definite strike against it. Though, kind of on the positive side, the game does not have any platforming, which is often the bane of the existence of platformers with isometric perspectives, because you have difficulty gauging distances from the camera angle. We have maps of the first 5 levels of the game, as well as notes on levels 6 and 7, and on the final boss fight. While the Immortal manages not to have any isometric platforming for you to contend with, it still manages to be a terrible game. This game is an exploration-based adventure game where you play a wizard exploring a dungeon and trying to defeat enemies in order to rescue your master at the bottom of the dungeon. Conceptually, this is fine. Plenty of excellent games have been made with similar concepts. The problem is the execution. Combat is done through a weird camera perspective where we go out of the main game screen and then where you, with a big portrait of your character, gets in a sort of Punch-Out-esque fight with whoever the enemy is. Now, this can work, because it worked great for Punch-Out, just managing the timing of your blocks and dodges and when you do your attacks. That's fine. But Punch-Out had a camera angle where you're behind the back of your character looking head-on at your enemy, which made it work better to gauge distances of attacks and timing and that sort of thing. Here we have this weird, again, kind of isometric again angle, but from a different direction, and so it's hard to judge the distances quite right and get the timing quite right. You can do it, but it's hard to tell. And the response, or rather it's hard to get a reaction as far to tell, did I actually successfully block or not? We have no separate sound effects for blocking versus, say, hitting. Further, the game has a limited number of continues, which is particularly bizarre considering this is a game that was designed entirely for personal computers. This was never meant in arcades. So, why not just let you, save your game or get a password and just keep going? Additionally, there are traps that can trigger an accident, not because you don't know that you're there, but because the isometric camera angle means your head on the sprite can collide with either a tile that triggers the trap or something else, and this leads you to get hit with a fireball or other projectile, and cause you to take damage or die, even though, based on where your feet are positioned on the map, the shot should just miss. Consequently, we have a game here with a really good concept, set with a poor camera angle, poor combat system, and an ill-conceived continue system. There really isn't anything that makes this game worth saving, so you should just skip it. In the classified information column, we get a tip that lets you start with 10 lives on each continue in Castlevania 3, which is definitely one which I will probably use at some point in the future when I'm playing Castlevania 3. Next up is Deja Vu, another adventure game from ICOM, the developers of Shadowgate. The article has a walkthrough of the early stages of the game, along with a map of the game's locations. Deja Vu is, like Shadowgate, a point-and-click adventure game. However, unlike Shadowgate, because this is a noir-themed adventure game, the puzzles have a lot more logic to them. You don't have to worry about fantasy magic logic. It's real-world logic we're dealing with. Penalties for failure are also a little less absurd. I mean, there are still plenty of places in the game where you can just die outright, but you're dying for reasons which kind of make sense, as opposed to putting a gem in a spot that you really shouldn't have, or putting a torch in a socket in the wall that triggers a trap that causes you to drop into a pit of spikes, or something similar. The game still has a significant amount of challenge, but I consider the game to be pretty fun and a lot more fair about it. The one problem I have with the game is when I last played it, I managed to solve the case and got the stuff together, but the last puzzle of the game has you disposing of evidence that is bogus that will frame you, that would lead to you getting framed for murder, and for some reason I thought I got rid of all of it, but I still ended up getting arrested and convicted anyway. I'm not quite sure what I did right or wrong there. Mainly what I did wrong. most enjoyable game, and actually, I'd like to see this get a remake a lot more than the recent Shadowgate remake that's just recently come out on the PC. Sunsoft has another movie licensed game with Gremlins 2. It's got a top-down perspective like Fester's Quest did, but thankfully it omits the Sunsoft shot upgrade path, or at least cuts the sine wave shot out of the whole equation. The guide has maps of the first 5 levels of the game. Gremlins 2 is almost the perfect improvement on the top-down Sunsoft shooter formula we'd gotten with Blaster Master and Fester's Quest, or rather, half of Blaster Master and half-ish 3/4 of Fester's Quest. The sine wave shot is gone. The level designs are simplified without being dumbed down, and the weapon selection is improved. Everything was almost perfect. And then they put situations where you have to shoot at a diagonal on the NES controller. This is a feat that I can barely pull off in an emulator when I'm playing with a 6-button Genesis controller, which is designed to let you easily pull off Hadoukens. I can't imagine trying to do it on the less forgiving NES D-pad. Additionally, while you have power-ups you can purchase at in-game stores with currency collection in-game, you can only purchase one thing, even if you have enough money to buy everything. If you get a game over, you start the level over from the beginning with no currency. Now, some of these stores sell extra lives, which will let you continue on later, but on the other hand, power-ups come so rarely from drops, particularly not so much things like health refills, that you have to choose between, say, buying an extra life that will let you continue with full health, or filling up your health, or even upgrading your shot so you can deal more damage and shoot in different directions, or get spread shots, or that sort of thing. Other than that, and some rather cheap hits on jumps, the game works remarkably well. It's the kind of game that's good enough from a gameplay standpoint that I would recommend playing it, but I'd also recommend playing it with, say, a Game Genie, rather than just playing it straight. The game's Game Genie codes would probably, well, they address a fair amount of the game's shortcomings and do generally make the game a little more playable. We move on next to the Game Boy games with an adaptation of gaming's first QuickTime event, Dragon's Lair, being done as a platformer on the Game Boy. The article gives notes for many of the game's levels. Dragon's Lair, for the Game Boy, is utter crap. Aside from the presence of Dirk the Daring, there is no connection I can see with the original game. The platforming controls are very iffy, and like Splunker and its successor Splunky, there is a height limit to how far you can fall, which makes navigating the game's levels more difficult. Even more obnoxiously, in the original game in the arcade, Dirk effectively has 3 abilities. Dodge, which also kind of counts for jump, and attack with his sword. Attack with your sword is no longer an option you can do in this game. You can jump, and you can move. Which means that Dirk is actually less skilled as a protagonist than he was in the original game. Further, some of the game's levels here have environments which aren't from the arcade version at all. There was no mummy or Egyptian-themed portion of the arcade game, so I almost wonder if this game was originally born as something else, and then the developers slapped the Dragon's Lair license on it for some bizarre reason. We'll probably come to a couple other of the Dragon's Lair platformers later on, and they might be an improvement, but otherwise, avoid this game, at least the Game Boy game. Sunsoft has another movie licensed game with Gremlins 2. It's got a top-down perspective like Fester's Quest did, but thankfully it omits the Sunsoft shot upgrade path, or at least cuts the sine wave shot out of the whole equation. The guide has maps of the first 5 levels of the game. Gremlins 2 is almost the perfect improvement on the top-down Sunsoft shooter formula we'd gotten with Blaster Master and Fester's Quest, or rather, half of Blaster Master and half-ish 3/4 of Fester's Quest. The sine wave shot is gone. The level designs are simplified without being dumbed down, and the weapon selection is improved. Everything was almost perfect. And then they put situations where you have to shoot at a diagonal on the NES controller. This is a feat that I can barely pull off in an emulator when I'm playing with a 6-button Genesis controller, which is designed to let you easily pull off Hadoukens. I can't imagine trying to do it on the less forgiving NES D-pad. Additionally, while you have power-ups you can purchase at in-game stores with currency collection in-game, you can only purchase one thing, even if you have enough money to buy everything. If you get a game over, you start the level over from the beginning with no currency. Now, some of these stores sell extra lives, which will let you continue on later, but on the other hand, power-ups come so rarely from drops, particularly not so much things like health refills, that you have to choose between, say, buying an extra life that will let you continue with full health, or filling up your health, or even upgrading your shot so you can deal more damage and shoot in different directions or get spread shots or that sort of thing. Other than that, and some rather cheap hits on jumps, the game works remarkably well. It's the kind of game that's good enough from a gameplay standpoint that I would recommend playing it, but I'd also recommend playing it with, say, a Game Genie, rather than just playing it straight. The game's Game Genie codes would probably, well, they address a fair amount of the game's shortcomings and do generally make the game a little more playable. We move on next to the Game Boy games with an adaptation of gaming's first QuickTime event, Dragon's Lair, being done as a platformer on the Game Boy. The article gives notes for many of the game's levels. Dragon's Lair, for the Game Boy, is utter crap. Aside from the presence of Dirk the Daring, there is no connection I can see with the original game. The platforming controls are very iffy, and like Splunker and its successor Splunky, there is a height limit to how far you can fall, which makes navigating the game's levels more difficult. Even more obnoxiously, in the original game in the arcade, Dirk effectively has 3 abilities. Dodge, which also kind of counts for jump, and attack with his sword. Attack with your sword is no longer an option you can do in this game. You can jump, and you can move. Which means that Dirk is actually less skilled as a protagonist than he was in the original game. Further, some of the game's levels here have environments which aren't from the arcade version at all. There was no mummy or Egyptian-themed portion of the arcade game, so I almost wonder if this game was originally born as something else, and then the developers slapped the Dragon's Lair license on it for some bizarre reason. We'll probably come to a couple other of the Dragon's Lair platformers later on, and they might be an improvement, but otherwise, avoid this game, at least the Game Boy game. Next is Mercenary Force, which looks like a sort of formation-based shoot-'em-up with a feudal Japanese theme. Mercenary Force is a shooter with a very novel concept. Rather than controlling one fighter, or a suit of power armor, or a guy with a jetpack, you control a group of warriors who shoot in different directions based on what type you have, and who have different shots which also have different strengths, and who have different levels of hit points based on who they are, and all this sorts of thing. Different groups of warriors in different formations work best for different levels, and you have opportunities to change your loadout in between levels with money dropped by enemies you kill during the game. My complaint with this game is there is no way for you to restock or on hit points or characters or heal your characters during levels. In other shoot-'em-ups like Gradius or R-Type, you get weapon power-ups during the game, like Spread Shot or lasers or homing missiles or what have you. Here, the type of shots you have are based on what characters you put in your loadout. In games like Fantasy Zone, which have currency and a purchasing system, like with this game, there are shops you can reach in levels that let you buy power-ups and restock on health and all that sort of thing. But there's nothing of the sort here. Fantasy Zone and Gradius, they're the two main sort of archetypes of the shooter in terms of how they handle power-up systems. And basically, Mercenary Force decides, nah, we're not going to do any of these. So, I recommend checking out the game, but with reservations. This is probably something I'd recommend playing on a device like the Super Game Boy or the Retron 5, than on the actual handheld with a smaller screen, just because of size of the characters and navigating the levels and that sort of thing. But even then, I beat the first level, but I didn't want to play much more than that. Next is Burai Fighter, which is a jetpack shooter that we'd previously seen on the NES, and which now has come to the Game Boy. Now, I've said in the past that I'm not a fan of jetpack shoot-'em-ups, and the ones I've played thus far, as far as shoot-'em-ups in general, on the Game Boy, have been generally inferior to their console counterparts. So, when I came to Burai Fighter, my expectations were not high. However, I found myself pleasantly surprised, as this is quite possibly the best shoot-'em-up I've played on the Game Boy, at least thus far. And certainly it's the best jetpack shoot-'em-up I've played pretty much ever. Even better than Section Z on the NES. I don't say that lightly. I can more easily evade projectiles in this game than I can on similar games on consoles, and the number of bullets on screen are appropriate for what you can evade in with a ship with that size of a hitbox, and with that small of a screen. Even better, the game uses a password system with unlimited continues, so that you can continue where you left off if you had to stop playing because you reached your destination or were called in for your appointment. It's not as good as if the game supports saves, but it works, particularly since the passwords are simple, 4 letters long, easy to remember if you can't write them down, and simple to write down on pretty much anything you have available, index card, receipt, whatever. This is what I want in a shoot-'em-up that I take with me on the go. Frankly, of all the Game Boy games I've played thus far, I consider this one to be the closest to a must-buy. Next is F1 Race, a racing game on the Game Boy with a pole position style camera angle. Well, if any game does what it says on the tin, it's this one. It's a pole position style behind the back racing game with all the problem that entails. In terms of the AI of other drivers, the fact that you have to win a race in order to advance, as opposed to placing in like top 3, all the races are 2 laps long, all of which mean that you have no margin for error. The controls are otherwise decent, but considering how easy it is to get a hold of consoles that can play SNES games and copies of F-Zero, I'd recommend getting F-Zero instead. We wrap up the Game Boy games with Super Scrabble, which also is exactly what it says on the tin. So, this is a workable Scrabble game, and that's all I can say for it. To the game's credit, if a word is not in the game dictionary, you can override the game, but that also makes it really easy to cheat in single player. Additionally, while the computer can challenge you, you can't challenge the computer, and on more few occasions, it's looked like the computer has made up some words in the course of the game, and there's nothing you can do to call it on its BS. As it stands, if you've got a copy of Words with Friends on your tablet or smartphone, and you probably do, then you're better off playing that. In the Game Boy Classified Information column, we get a tip for Nemesis, which has the location of warps that will take you to bonus stages in levels 2 and 4 of the game. In this issue's Howard and Nestor, our heroes are playing Solar Jetman, and we get some advice on weapon selection. Next is the Miracle Piano Teaching System. Before there was Rocksmith, there was this. And because of the nature of this program, as it's more of a program than a game, I'm not really going to be able to review it at all. I'll see if I can find someone who actually has done a review of it. I think Gamester81 has done a review, and I'll put a link in the show notes. In Counselor's Corner, we have questions on how to start with Dungeon Magic, as well as some help solving puzzles in Swords and Serpents. And in the Now Playing column, we have a preview for a game that was reviewed by the angry video game nerd, Silver Surfer. Finally, in the Celebrity Profile column, well, almost finally, in Celebrity Profile, we have a feature on New Kids on the Block, featuring Mark Wahlberg's brother Donnie. The New Kids on the Block have their own game coming out in the future from Parker Brothers, and this article is basically a hype piece. Finally, we wrap up this issue with the Pack Watch column. Taxan is making a G.I. Joe game, there's a look at Metal Storm, which is going to be a cover game in the future, and most notably, we have a look at 3 launch titles for the Super Nintendo: Pilot Wings, F-Zero, and Super Mario World. My pick of the issue for this week is Megaman 3 for the NES, on that side of the coin, and while we don't really have any good multiplayer games, we do have a very big selection of Game Boy games, so I'll have a Game Boy pick of the week, well, pick of the issue for this time. And in this case, my pick is Burai Fighter. It's really what I consider the first major must-have game we've got for the Game Boy thus far. Not even the Mario game, Super Mario Land, for the Game Boy quite cut it and did as well as this game did. Next issue, though, we'll get one of the odder first-party NES titles with, not odder, but one of the more unique one, yeah, odder is probably a better term. Odder first-party NES titles with Star Tropics. I'll see you then.